If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, cops and other law enforcement. Have you had any creepy, supernatural experiences while on duty? Military policeman in the Marine Corps. While stationed at Camp Lejeune, a dispatcher got a call from a terrified wife that kids were trying to get into her house. It was a little after midnight. We thought this was just a drunken spouse call and responded, not on high alert, just kind of wanting to make sure the lady was alright. We knocked on the door and announced ourselves. The woman is obviously shaken, still with puffy eyes. She tells us, 4 children with red eyes rang her doorbell and asked to come inside, and when she refused, they got angry. The kids terrorized her for 5 minutes, her own child was put to bed and her husband was deployed. I decided to do a once-over of the whole housing property, and there was a whole load of nothing going on. My partner and I decided to do a little walking patrol of that housing area. In each housing area, there's usually a decent-sized playground. As we were walking up to it, we both saw some kids swinging. Curfew is 8 p.m. for young children unless accompanied by an adult on base. I'm ducking spooked at this point, and I know my partner is too. They look over at us and just stare. We started backtracking and then turned and didn't look back, and we didn't talk about it the rest of the night either. Later on, I looked up the incident online since Lejeune is famous for lots of paranormal activity, and it turns out the little red-eyed kids have been reported before. Grandmother was a cop in Santa Maria in the late 70s and early 90s. A man calls in, saying there is a 7-foot-tall gray man at his door. She goes to check it out, but the door is jammed. The man is screaming, and she hears a loud buzzard. She slams the door open, and the buzz is gone, as is the man. There's blood everywhere. She calls for backup and runs around and calls his name. She hears what sounds like someone yelling, but someone is covering their mouth. She finds him tied up and pissed everywhere. Investigators say that he was in that room for at least 4 hours. A man lives alone in the middle of nowhere. He says he called the police 5 hours ago. Said that a cop was on his way. He reported seeing a 7-foot-tall gray man with big eyes who did that to him. No footprints, no trace of any kind of invasion. My grandmother lost 4 hours somehow. The guy ended up killing himself a few years later, leaving a note behind, warning my grandmother that they are after him and thanking her for rescuing him. Shit's ducking crazy. Not a cop, but a fraud investigator. I went to the site of a fire that had been torched in a small town in North Carolina. The police chalked it up to an unfortunate accident, but the insurance company still wanted me to investigate. I got there, and there was one almost perfect circular area that had not been burned at all, but the materials on it had been burned to a crisp, including the desk and computer. However, the floor was still looking as if nothing had happened besides water damage. Upon further inspection, I found out the desk belonged to a woman whose husband had died in a house fire not too long ago. I was severely weirded out, but since that wasn't what I was there for, I wasn't able to inspect it further. After I wrapped up my investigation at the site, I contacted the owners and asked them a few questions, bringing up the death of the woman's husband and whether perhaps she had any motives due to his death to commit arson. They told me the story about how he died and how there was an almost perfect circle in the house that had been untouched by the fire. I wrapped up my case without any closure, but I still wonder from time to time what the duck is going on with that town. My uncle works for dispatch in my town, and he recently told my family about the weirdest call he's ever gotten. He says that he received a call from a landline one night, and when he answered it, there was only static on the other end. This happened 2 more times. Finally, he calls a squad to go check out the address from the caller ID. When the cops got there and walked into the house, they immediately saw that there was a dead body. The person had been dead for 5 months. The craziest part about it was that there was no electricity or any other utility working. So there is no way they should have been able to get those calls into dispatch. But if they hadn't, who knows how long that person's body would have stayed there. My uncle was the sheriff of a small town in New Mexico. He was the most hardcore person in our family, super straight-laced, never really beast, and wasn't at all a joker. So when he told this story, backed up by my aunt, we all believed it without question. A local reporter named Bob D would always show up at any major police activity via the police scanner. Big car wrecks, fires, or anything worth reporting in the local paper, everybody on the force knew Bob D. He was around at least once or twice a week at various police activities. Bob was a bit of a joker himself. He would mess with people by flicking behind their ears. People would react to the flicks, thinking it was a bug, only to turn around and see it was Bob jerking around. Everybody liked Bob. Unfortunately, Bob had bad lung cancer and died pretty suddenly. His wife buried him, against his wishes. He wanted to be cremated. For the next couple of weeks, after his funeral, people kept talking about seeing Bob at car wrecks and fires, all the same stuff he used to report on. There were 20 to 30 reports like this from civilians and members of the force. My uncle didn't buy it. Until the night he and my aunt showed up at our house, gun drawn, pale as paper. We asked him what the hell happened, and he had to sit down, take his breath, compose himself, and start to outline what happened. Note, this is a guy that I never saw get rattled by anything. He said. My aunt and he were sitting on the couch in their house watching TV. My uncle kept scratching at his ear over and over. Finally, my aunt asked him what the problem was, and he turned around just in time to see their bedroom door open. Bob D. is standing there in the doorway. Clear as day. My uncle jumped up, cussed or something, and got my aunt's attention, who turned to see him there too. As soon as they both made eye contact with him, Bob smiled, turned, and walked across the living room and out their front door. He closed the door behind himself and was gone. My uncle got control of himself and ran outside. Gun drawn, I looked for Bob, but he was gone. At that point, they ran over to our place. We went over there and didn't see anything, but my aunt and uncle stayed at our place that night. At work the next day, all the guys on the force were giving my uncle lots of "we told you so." People around town said they saw Bob D show up at police scenes for at least another 2 to 3 months. My dad saw him in our darkroom in our basement with a friend. He was flicking their ears in the dark. During the 3rd month, people who saw him kept saying he was looking worse and worse. My uncle saw him 2 more times, each time confirming that he was looking more and more worn. My dad had concluded that he was decomposing, and his ghost was reflecting that process. Every time my ear itches, I get goosebumps. I called a residence out in the boonies, this was in Wyoming, so the boonies are really the boonies, at about 11 p.m. about suspicious activity. When we get there, we are told by the family living there that there are very strange screams coming from a creek area about 1,000 feet out. And sure enough, after waiting outside on the porch with them for about a minute, I heard it. It is very hard to describe what it sounded like. It was like a woman in very severe distress, but higher pitched, and each scream lasted for about 10 to 15 seconds. It never sounded like it was saying anything, it just sounded like a cry of sheer terror. And it repeated itself again. We tell the family we are going to investigate, so we just walk down to the creek since it was nice out. We hear about 2 more screams, getting louder as we approach the creek. By now, we're both kind of freaked out. There are 2 possibilities, someone is getting murdered or mauled in the creek bed, or it's a wild animal. As we approach the creek bed, we hear no screams for about 5 minutes. We search around and find nothing, yelling at the top of our lungs for somebody to come towards us if they are there. Then we hear the exact same scream behind us, exactly from where we came from. We get about halfway back to the house, and the scream comes so loudly that it seems to be right next to us. We frantically shine our flashlights everywhere and find nothing, no eye glints of animals, no rustling of bushes, just silence. We trace our steps back, and the scream comes from around the creek again. This time, it lasted about 30 seconds and was much louder than before. Our retreat becomes a little more hastened. By this time, we were both scared shitless and verified with the family that they should call us again if they heard it. They never called again, and we got the hell out of there. I still don't know what it was, but as an avid outdoorsman, I know no animal makes a cry like that, especially one that can move stealthily without being spotted by flashlights. Something else that weirded me out was that it was completely silent while the screams were happening. During summer in Wyoming, there is always some type of ambient animal sound, frogs croaking, crickets chirping, owls hooting, coyotes howling, etc., but there is nothing. Until we were leaving and the screams had stopped. Then a frog started croaking. It gives me the creeps just thinking about it. Not me, but my father-in-law. He worked as a deputy for years, and just before he got his job with the state troopers, he got a call to check on an older man in maybe his 80s who claimed that there was an alien in his closet. Now apparently, this man had been calling about this alien for 3 days, but they never sent anyone to check on it because they thought the guy was crazy. This was back in the late 70s and early 80s in rural Florida, so apparently ignoring someone's emergency calls because crazy was something that was okay. So he gets to the guy's house, and the old man is immediately relieved. He starts going on and on about how he didn't know what he was going to do with the alien, and he had it locked in the closet for the last 3 days. Should he be bringing in military backup? My father-in-law tells him that he is qualified to handle situations like this, that it's part of the training, the whole thing, to get the guy to calm down and show him what is in the closet because now he is concerned that there actually might be someone there. The old guy opens the closet and shows him what's inside. Apparently, A Jehovah's Witness or some similar missionary had come to the old man's door, and because the missionary was Indian, he freaked out, whacked the guy over the head, and tied him up in the closet. Poor guy was covered in shit and piss, totally dehydrated, and barely coherent when he finally got out of the closet. Both the old guy and the missionary ended up being taken to the hospital, where the missionary got treatment, and the old guy had to wait for his son to come get him because they didn't want to repeat. I worked as a police officer in a small town in rural Nebraska. Back in the 1990s, I was patrolling through town in the winter. We had several abandoned houses in town, but one seemed to attract copper thieves, so we were told to keep an eye on it. I drove by it around 7 p.m., and since it sat on a corner lot, I had a clear view of all four sides of the house. As I drove around the corner, nothing looks out of the ordinary. About 2 hours later, I drive by again, and the back door is wide open. I know that the back door was not open when I drove by it earlier. Looking at the snow on the ground around the house, there were no footprints. So I think, what the hell? Call dispatch, tell them I'm investigating an open door at that address, and ask for a county sheriff to start my way. I walk to the open door, pull out my flashlight, and shine it inside. The house has obviously been gutted for the most part. The plaster walls have been torn down, and debris piles everywhere. Since there were no footprints in the snow around the door other than mine, and with all the dust on the floor not showing any footprints, I chalk it up to the wind, or maybe the door just opened on its own. I was about to secure the door when I heard a loud thump come from upstairs and what sounded like kids laughing. So I enter the house and yell out, "Police department, come downstairs." More of what sounds like kids playing. I tell dispatch that it sounds like there are kids in the house and start making my way through the kitchen into the living room, where the stairs are. All the while cautiously checking the main floor. 2 more times I hear something upstairs, but since I've had no response, I start thinking maybe it's an animal. Still, I hear what I'd swear were kids laughing. I head upstairs, and it all gets quiet. The upstairs is relatively small, with a hallway at the top of the stairs that has one bedroom on the right, one straight ahead at the end of the hall, and a bedroom on the left. As I get to the top of the stairs, I hear a thump in the bedroom to the left. I carefully peek around the door, and it's an empty room with a small pile of plaster and wood debris in the middle. No kidding, sitting on top of the pile of debris was a page torn out of a child's book with a picture of a police officer on it. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. I got out of that room, quickly cleared the other rooms upstairs, and got the duck out of there. I told dispatch nobody was in the house, locked the back door, and never went back in there again. About 2 years ago, when I was stationed in a small town, I was dispatched to a rural neighborhood with very few houses. The dispatcher told me that it was an old lady who claimed that she heard footsteps in her attic while she was in the kitchen. These were her exact words: "I'm hiding in the storeroom on the first floor right now. Please hurry, the footsteps are getting louder and something up there is crying." This might sound crazy, but I think there's a ghost up there. The dispatcher told me this exact story, and when I reached the house, I went straight to the storeroom on the first floor after some searching and got the lady out of the house. At the time, police cars were sent off in squads of 4, so me and my buddy went up to the attic while the other 2 escorted the lady to the car as she was in shock. So we went up to the attic, heard all the sounds she was making, turned on our flashlights, and saw it. It was a goddamn ghost, for real, no kidding. We saw a ghost for real, no bullshit, for the first time, and all those stories always leave a vague possibility of it being explained by science, but nope. This was a real ghost, just walking back and forth and crying. So we shot it. I had a call to a residence for a mental evaluation, or a 5,150. Anyways, I get there and speak to a 50-something-year-old woman, who states her 20-something-year-old son is under the influence of an unknown drug and keeps repeating that he can't go in his bedroom because there is an old man hanging in his room. She stated she was too scared to go in his room and investigate it for herself because he constantly brings over friends that are drug addicts and is unsure if his claims are true or not, one former police officer said. I then go speak to the son, who is clearly under the influence of a stimulant. He goes on to tell me that he was told by a spirit not to enter the bedroom because her father, dressed in his military Class A uniform, was hanging in there. I checked the room out, and of course there was no body hanging in the room. As I'm in the middle of explaining to the mother that there was no body in the bedroom, a veteran officer arrives on scene to assist me. He pulls me aside and states that earlier in his career, he responded to this residence, and in that same bedroom, he had to investigate the suicide by hanging of an older male subject. He didn't remember all the details, so I looked it up in our report management system in my patrol car, and sure enough, the officer was correct. The subject who died was a World War II veteran who dressed in his military uniform and hung himself. My brother was a traffic cop in a rural county for 20 years. He always went for the night shifts, finding them generally more interesting in his jurisdiction. The short of it is that he was stopped at an unlit crossroads in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by endless farmland on all sides. It was the middle of the night, and the only light came from his headlights and the instruments on his dashboard. He knew this particular area well, as he tended to loiter in it during the quietest part of the night. Given that this was a rural area with such a low population, they would have a single officer at that time of night, and they shared a dispatcher with the local FD. He was doing paperwork while sitting there. Suddenly, the entire truck and area around it were lit up with this harsh white light. He was terrified at first and sat motionless for what he described as several minutes. The only sound he heard was his own idling engine as he sat parked there. Then he was standing outside in the middle of the street, looking up at a blinding white light that shut off with no trace. The moment it shut off, there was a clear night sky above him, and this was in the very early 80s, so he was almost staring up at the Milky Way. He says he doesn't remember getting out of his patrol car. He says that the whole thing lasted about 10 minutes, and his wristwatch and patrol car worked without issue. When this happened, he didn't say anything at first. But he stopped working nights for a while. After 5 years of nights, a handful of other cops covered him for a while. I remember him acting strangely for a while, perhaps grappling with whatever happened. When he ultimately told my parents and me about it, there was a lot of concern. I was a kid when Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out, and being young and dumb, I immediately started joking with him about that, but stopped when it was obvious something was wrong. He pursued the medical approach to things and went through all these tests, afraid maybe it was a brain tumor or something. They found nothing. He ultimately went back to working nights until the late 1980s, when the population grew and hard drugs started appearing in the community. He never mentioned having another experience like it again. But I know it still bothers him. Whatever happened to him a few years ago, he was visiting. We were working on something in the garage. I have this super bright flashlight that emits this harsh white light that lights up whatever I point it at. At one point, I aimed it in his general direction, and I could see his expression change and him freeze up. His demeanor changed entirely. When I was checking on him because it was so strange that he seemed to shut off, he just mentioned he was thinking of the light at the crossroads, gave a forced smile, and seemed to return to normal. I'm not a cop, but I had a really interesting paranormal experience in boot camp. Boot camp is like jail to me. Each floor has 2 bays, which house 50 people. Basically, one huge bunk room filled with 50 bunks. 2 people take 1-hour fireguard shifts. Basically, just walking around the bay and cleaning. Now, towards the end of basic training, we all told each other we had seen some SHT, but everyone was too afraid to tell each other during the beginning of basic training. 5 people in one night during week 2 in basic saw soldiers standing at attention on the kill zone, a big rectangle in the middle of the bay that we form up around during roll call, basically 5 feet from the foot of our bunks. One even rushed to the line only to see nobody there. People on fireguard saw a figure standing in the hallway to the bathroom on multiple occasions. I was on fireguard shift with my battle buddy, and he looked over me towards the bathroom hallways and freaked the duck out. He saw a shadow of a man standing at parade rest. I've never seen somebody get that freaked out. The bathroom lights turn on automatically through sensors. I would see shadows in the bathroom and go to inspect, and nobody would be there. Showers at night would turn on even though everyone was in their bunks. One time our door somehow opened, which sent a silent alarm to the drill sergeant in the office. Nobody was up besides the 2 fire guards. We got a good smoke on that one. People would feel somebody sitting on their bunks and look up, but nobody was there. One time we came back from a field exercise and we could see from outside our bays that the lights were on, and even the drill sergeants were confused as duck. Because the building doors were locked and secured, nobody had access to our building. Our building was built in the 1960s, and we were told many suicides happened. A girl killed herself a year before in the bay below us. My girlfriend's dad is an ex-EMT and police officer, so he's got a ton of stories. One day we were sitting around and he was telling me some of the more messed up ones, and I asked if anything really creepy had ever happened to him. So he starts to tell me about this one late night call from when he was an EMT. He and his partner are called out to this guy's house, who is a pretty wealthy and well-off guy. That'll make sense later, and he's complaining about chest pain but is otherwise fine. So they load him up to go and have him looked at, and they start transporting him to the nearest hospital. My girlfriend's dad is talking to the guy, and everything's fine, but then all of a sudden the guy screams and starts to go into cardiac arrest out of nowhere, with no warning signs, nothing. And he's screaming about big black dogs chasing them and telling them to drive faster or they're going to get him. Then the dude just made flat lines. He's DOA when they reached the ER. His partner pulled him to the side and told him he was going home because that mother ducker just got snatched up by demons and he was done for the night. The first story takes place in 1991. My ex-boyfriend's dad was the chief of police of a small town located directly outside of a city. He had several police officers who worked for him, and one was a young rookie cop whom I'll call Mike. The police officers in that jurisdiction often assisted the city police with calls. Mike was going to make such a call one cold day in the beginning of March. He was driving down a road that, on either side, was a field of tall, dead brown grass. All of a sudden, Mike saw what he thought was an animal coming out of the grass on the left side. He said he saw the next sequence of events in slow motion. He tried to slow his cruiser down. He saw that it was not an animal but indeed a small, bald, dirty man dressed in ragged clothes, approximately 2 feet tall, running out from the grass. He slammed on the brakes. The cruiser did not stop fast enough, and he hit the small man with the front of the car. The man flew up in the air. Mike jumped out and ran to the front. He said he looked right down at the small man, whom he then noticed had reddish-brown hair. The little man began a screaming, evil laugh and hopped up, running into the grass on the right side of the road. Mike ran after him, but all he heard was the sound of his mocking laugh. When Mike got back to the station, he was visibly shaken. My ex's father said he was pale white and could barely choke out the story. When he finished telling them what happened, everyone except my ex's dad began howling with laughter. The other cops teased him relentlessly about the leprechaun story. Since it was about 3 weeks before St. Patrick's Day, one of the cops went to the dollar store and bought a leprechaun hat. He left it on Mike's doorstep with a note stuck in the brim saying, "I'm coming for you, Mikey." The next morning, Mike came in crying and told my ex's father he was quitting the police. My ex's father believed Mike and said he could tell he was extremely sincere in his belief that he'd hit a leprechaun. He told the other cops to leave him alone about it, and Mike worked with him for years to come. I was working the night shift and was still in training with my FTO. I was in phase 2 of 4 at the time. We get dispatched to the southern end of the city. It's a cove that goes up along the side of a mountain and is very dark, indicating suspicious activity. Well, the house in question was the scene of a dead body call a few months prior, a very nasty one where the body was left undisturbed for weeks before a call. Neighbors reported the sounds of talking, banging, laughing, and crying from at least 4 people. Well, my FTO and I arrive without trouble, and I park the marked unit down the street with the lights off and windows down, and we hear distinct talking coming from the building. We were out of sight from the building, and neither one of us had ever responded to the house prior to that night, so we did not know what it looked like. My FTO looked at me and said the typical training officer thing, "What are you going to do, trainee?" I told him that he and I would make our approach and ask for an additional since it sounds like we're outnumbered. That is exactly what we did. As we approached the house on foot, the house was completely dark, and the windows were boarded up with a city notice indicating the house was not safe for human occupation. Figuring it was a bunch of tweakers, we stood by for the additional unit before thoroughly searching. After the unit arrived, we searched the surrounding area of the house, which led into the desert, but we were unable to find footprints or people. We turned our attention back to the house and entered the building through the back. I took point. I announced our presence and heard shuffling inside the building. I indicated to my partners that I heard shuffling, and my FTO agreed, as he was by the door, prepared to open it. The smell was horrible, it reeked. The house was pitch black as we entered. I turned to my left and held position as my partner followed in. We were standing on the outline left by the corpse rotting a few weeks prior. None of us had been to the house before, so we were disoriented inside the pitch black room. My partner shined his light down the hall after we secured the entryway. He immediately started to run down the hallway, telling whatever he saw to stop. My FTO and I followed suit. We were led into the master bedroom, where we stopped. My partner was thoroughly confused and told FTO and me what he had seen. He saw a white face, about 4 feet 11 inches from the ground, grin at him and turn around, heading to the master bedroom. The room was empty and clear of all furniture. We searched the rest of the house and found nothing, not even an animal. We exited the house and left. About 2 hours later, we received the same call again. Again, we searched and found nothing. The next morning, we reviewed the body cam from the partner and saw what appeared to be half a face. We also reviewed the audio and found several murmurs in the background that we did not hear at the time. Unfortunately, those videos were discarded after 180 days since the call did not lead to any arrest or public contact. My old man was with the police. He was driving down a country road one night when he noticed a motorcycle and some guy standing at the side of the road. My dad pulled over as it was late and a dangerous area for the guy to be stranded. My dad spoke to the guy, and it turned out his bike cut out and wouldn't restart. After some chit-chat, my dad quickly returned to the police van for some reason. When he returned to speak to the motorcyclist, there was nobody there. My dad looked around and listened for the noise of a motor or footsteps, but there was nothing. It seemed that in the 20 seconds since he had popped into the van, the motorcyclist and his bike had vanished. My dad called out for a bit in case he and the bike had relocated somewhere out of sight, but it quickly dawned on my father that he was on a country road and there was nowhere for the motorcyclist to disappear to that quickly with a heavy bike. My dad said he freaked the hell out, got in the van, and left quickly. He said the weirdest part was that he physically touched the guy and the bike. A few days later, after mentioning it to a colleague, it turned out that a biker a few years prior was killed in that spot in a traffic accident, and that he's not the first to mention such an incident. He hates talking about it even today. I am a police officer in a large inner city in the Midwest, and violent crimes such as shootings, stabbings, and literally anything else you could possibly imagine are not uncommon. Sometimes we deal with multiple shootings a day, but this night was different. My partner and I were dispatched to a felonious assault in progress. The computer automated dispatch notes stated that a male was being strangled by his wife and that she was attempting to stab him with a knife. As you can imagine, my partner and I arrived at the location rather quickly, and while approaching the residence, we observed the house to be completely silent and absent of light. We attempted to make contact with the occupants of the house multiple times by knocking on the front main door as well as the rear back door. It appeared that no one was home. While attempting to make contact with the homeowners, a concerned neighbor came out and asked what was going on. My partner informed the neighbor of the possible assault that could be occurring, and my partner then asked the neighbor if he had heard or seen anything. The neighbor stated that the male's wife had passed away a few months prior and that he had lived there alone since. Freaky stuff. Maybe the poor guy was going through some grieving issues. We never found out, though. I had a couple of weird things occur one night while working the night shift in a small town and received a call to the hospital. The call was from the lone security guard on site who didn't feel comfortable dealing with this on his own. The call was dispatched as urgent assistance. On my arrival at the hospital, the guard stated to me that nursing staff had heard what they referred to as blood-curdling screams coming out of the then-closed psychiatric unit. There were no patients or staff in the unit at the time. The door to the unit was a clear glass door, and there was nothing visible on the other side. I requested the keys to unlock the door, and after turning the key in the door and unlocking the deadbolt, before I was able to remove the keys from the door, something had forced the lock and relocked the door, resulting in my hand, still holding the key, being physically moved as well. I was pretty creeped out myself, lol, but based on the severity of the call, I still entered the room and conducted a search of the entire unit with no result. Immediately after clearing the unit, another call came in, but this time it was from a nurse walking to her car on the street. She also heard loud screams. I ran down to the hospital parking lot where another unit met me and we searched the area. I then came across a small park and could hear a very faint squeaking sound. I followed the sound only to come across a swing set of 4 swings. 3 swings were absolutely still as there was no wind, and the other was moving almost as if there was someone still sitting in it and pumping to gain momentum. I stood there in awe for a good 30 seconds, and the swing did not lose any momentum. What a weird night. Late one evening, maybe a decade ago, I ended up running silently to a call with additional units in tow. The caller reported hearing footsteps on her second floor when she was in the kitchen. She lived alone, was middle-aged, divorced, had no kids, and had no expected company. She is outside across the street when we arrive, obviously unnerved and being calmed by her neighbor. Other units showed up almost as I did and set up a perimeter at the corners of the property. We talk with her and get permission to enter, so we decide we'll announce ourselves and clear the house. 3 of us stack up on the front door, announce, and make entry while the other officers are viewing the windows from a distance under concealment. She was in the midst of making a really late dinner, so the house smells really good. I remember how good it smelled. Anyway, we clear the ground level and make our way to the stairs when we hear it. There are obviously footsteps on the wood floors above us. Not panicky OSHT, I'm caught footsteps and running to hide or escape. No, these were calm, methodic, and almost pace-like. We announce ourselves again, and there is no response except that the pacing just starts to sort of fade away. Quietly, I make my way up the steps, adrenaline pumping, and concentrating on piecing the corner at the top. I stop a few stairs shy of the corner, breathe, and proceed up. The hallway at the top was pitch black, and after successfully clearing the top or corner, we made our way down the hallway, clearing rooms. Nothing. Nobody. Not even a critter. Not that any critter would ever make what I describe as human footsteps on hardwood. After the initial search, a few of the other officers involved also checked every nook and cranny, bed, closet, rack, even the washer, dryer, appliances, and cupboards were thoroughly searched. Nothing was out of order. Nobody was hiding anywhere. Eventually, we invited the lady back into her residence and reassured her that there was nobody in there, and we equated her noise to maybe wood shrinkage or expansion in the home. None of the officers outside or after our initial search had seen anybody leave the top or bottom floors or windows. The house had no indication that anybody tried to force open a window or door. I stayed behind for about 30 minutes once the other officers cleared the call and waited while her friend showed up to stay the night with her. I went over basic security measures with her and double-checked that all her windows and doors were not compromised. She fed me well-done lasagna as I waited, and to this day, I'm convinced that I interacted with another dimension of life that day. I'm not a cop, but I had to respond to the call as an EMT. I'll start with the fact that this was up in the mountains, 8,000 feet above sea level. This guy calls 911 and claims there is a snake in his hotel room, so we go to check it out with the fire crew. We show up to a guy freaking out and saying there is a python loose in his room. Well, after a few questions, he claims there is a piranha trying to escape from the python's mouth, but the spirits in the python's brain are telling the python that it can't let the piranha go. Okay, now we know something is wrong with this guy. We walk into the room to find a rolled up towel sticking out of the bathroom door. The man claimed he had trapped the python in the door and was trying to let the piranha escape. We found acid and heroin inside the rolled up towel. Dude was having a great time until the towel stole his drugs. More drug-induced than paranormal, but the dude thought his towel was possession. I am a police officer working on an emergency response team in a busy London borough. We took a call about a suspected domestic incident in a block of flats. The informant said that she could hear screaming and sounds of disturbance coming from the flat above her own. Once we arrived, my colleague and I knocked on the door of the flat where the informant said the noise was coming from. I had heard nothing on my way up and certainly couldn't hear any disturbance coming from the address. To be honest, I heard nothing at all. After knocking twice, we had no response. My colleague left me to go downstairs and speak directly to the informant. I stayed by the door. I knocked again, and after some time, it was answered by an elderly woman. She had clearly been asleep and was alarmed to see me standing outside. I told her that someone had called saying that they could hear a disturbance coming from within her address. I asked her if there was anyone else inside with her. She looked bemused and told me that she lived alone and had been sleeping. I asked her if I could come in to satisfy myself that no one else was there. She invited me in, and I walked into what was a small, 2-bedroom flat. The flat was in darkness, apart from her hall light and her bedside lamp. I began searching through the flat. As I approached the final door, the living room, my colleague called me up on the radio. He told me that he was on his way and asked if I was okay. I told him everything was fine, wondering why he sounded so flustered. He told me that he was with the informant and could also hear screaming and loud thuds coming from the flat I was in. I told him that he must be mistaken, as I was almost done searching the flat and that I had heard nothing whatsoever. I have to admit to a feeling of unease as I opened the final door. Like all the other rooms, it was dark but freezing cold. My breath misted immediately. There was no one in the room, and there were no signs of disturbance. No window was open. I called my colleague and asked him to listen out for my footfall. He said he could hear my feet as I stamped them, but said that the screaming had stopped. This coincided with me opening the door. I left shortly after apologizing to the elderly woman for waking her. I have no rational explanation for this at all. My colleague and I left feeling very creeped out. I would talk to my father about some of his experiences while working the graveyard shift as a police officer. He has 2 that he told me about. We were from a small town, surrounded by other smaller farming towns. Our town has maybe 7,000 people in it, while the smaller towns have around 500 to 3,000, depending on the town. My father works as a police officer in one of these smaller towns, where a large part of his jurisdiction is farmland that is one house every mile. Along one of these stretches of farms is a very old cemetery that won't come up on any Google searches, and the name of it is Killin' It. It's kind of foreboding. This cemetery itself used to be tied to an old church, which burned down before we arrived in town. The church, before burning down, was supposedly tied to satanic rituals, which many believe led to paranormal activity there. Consequently, the graveyard is very popular for teenagers to go to at night and get drunk at, and I am guilty of this myself, although I did not see anything while I was there. My father, being a cop, was in the neighborhood and was checking out the cemetery to see if there were any kids running around or drinking. He pulled up to the side of the road and shined his light into the graveyard. He didn't see anything until he passed over the really old graves. He saw, as he says, a girl in a dress standing alone. It appeared so suddenly for him that he passed his light beyond her, and by the time he refocused on where his light was pointing, she was gone. He then got out of his squad and spent a moment calling out and seeing if anyone was there. As the cemetery has a reputation for being haunted, he didn't spend too long looking and left it that way. 2. In the town we live in, there is a relatively new store that deals in lighting fixtures and other electric items. Very much a home refurbishment store. Across the street from the store is an old, but still in use, gravel quarry. The land that both of these things exist on was owned by the same man, whose name I do not know. The owner died maybe 10 years ago and was very much a Scrooge. He wanted to be buried on his land, which helped him make all of his money. Thus he was buried behind the store, which is where my father's next story happens. My father received a call from dispatch that the alarms at the store had gone off, and he went to investigate. Our town is very small, so cops don't have partners, they're on their own. He arrives at the store, and sure enough, the alarm is going off. He opened up the building, whose doors were locked, and went inside to find that the lights upstairs in the manager's office were on. He went upstairs to see who was there and found that no one was in the room. The manager's room was fairly small, maybe measuring 20 feet by 20 feet, and only had filing cabinets, desks, and shelves in it. Nowhere someone could hide. My father looked around and, unsurprisingly, found no one on the premises. He turned off the alarm, turned off the lights, and locked the building. As he was about to radio it in, the alarm started going off again, so he unlocked the doors and ran inside. He heard footsteps again, this time coming from the manager's room, but all the lights were off. He turned them on and ran inside to look. No one was in the room, and there was only one entrance to this room, and you had to go up a metal staircase to get to it. My father again searched the building, and finding no one, he locked it up and left. A couple hours later, he heard another radio from dispatch saying the alarm was going off again, but this time another dispatch picked it up and handled it. Apparently this isn't the first time it's happened either, and multiple officers in the area report hearing footsteps and noises from that building at night but never finding anyone inside. I am not a cop, but I am a paramedic for a 911 service. We responded to a call for an old lady in her 90s who had fallen in her bathroom. We lost connection with our navigation system and were unable to find the house number because it had faded from the houses, low-income neighborhood. We found the house because the porch light began to flicker to signal us which house it was, and once we stopped in front of the house, the light stopped flickering and remained on. We grabbed our equipment, walked to the front door, knocked, and stated who we were. We heard a soft, manly "come in," and so we did, noticing the light switch was switched on in the on position. We walked into the house and had to walk through the kitchen, living room, and hallway to get to the bathroom, where the patient was. We had to walk through 3/4 of the house to get to her. Once I started to talk to her, she said that she couldn't hear me and said her hearing was on the bathroom sink. I gave it to her, we helped her up, helped her through the hallway to get to her bedroom, and put her in bed. We were probably in that house for an hour, helping her. This lady had to have had the worst case of scoliosis I had ever seen, making her need a walker to walk. In the bedroom, we began to ask her if she lived with anyone. She told us that she had been living alone in the house for 15 years since her husband died. We had helped this lady to bed, and it was time to leave. As we walked back out the front door, we immediately noticed the front porch light was off and the switch was off. We immediately got back in our ambulance and drove off, trying to analyze what we had seen and heard walking in. It's scary to think we were in there for an hour in a haunted house, but it's scarier to think there was another person in that house that we never noticed. My uncle worked as a cop in Ohakune, New Zealand. His station frequently gets reports from local hunters and farmers about hooded men walking around the forest in groups. Hunters, etc., frequently find ceremonial and ritual sites in the forest, sometimes even 10 to 15 kilometers inland through thick bush. Anyway, my uncle was called out to a farmer's property at about 2 a.m. about a decade ago because these groups of hooded men were walking up and down the tree line near his property with torches, placing objects, and scaring his family, the farm animals, and whatnot. Uncle arrives and approaches them. He says there were maybe 8, and they just watch him, torches in hand. Not a single one of them moved a muscle, and they just watched him as he tried to appeal to them to leave. After some minutes, being completely scared shitless and having no idea how to deal with the situation, he was waiting for backup to assist him when one of them began speaking in a manner that my uncle can only describe as seductive and somehow manipulated my uncle into letting them just walk away. He still doesn't remember what they said to him. He just remembers fading out slightly and then seeing the faces of his fellow officers when he came to. He claims they must have drugged or hypnotized him or something. My uncle doesn't believe in any paranormal stuff, though that experience messed with him a lot. He quit the force and became a commercial fisherman a few months later. A friend of mine's dad used to be a cop but is a probation officer now. Decided to go on a camping trip and wandered into a very suspicious problem. In Texas, there is an abandoned YMCA camp. No one knows why they left, and everything is still there. It seems like they just got up one day and left. No employees or campers have come out or said why. Well, he decided he, his son, and 2 other father officers would go on a camping trip there. They drive up to the city it's near and flash their badges, saying they need the code to get in. No one knows it or wants to give it to them. They finally get an 80-year-old bartender after a couple drinks. They enter, and it's exactly what they thought, abandoned, with sailboats and tents still there. They hike for a while and find a place to camp right next to a hill. He says he saw what looked like a man crouching down and watching them on top of the hill. He and another dad go up there to check him out, but when they get close, he's not there anymore. But when they walk back down and he's there again, they just assume it's a heat illusion or something. They go on with the day and go to bed. In the middle of the night, he hears his buddy outside on the left side of his tent, telling him, "Hey, can you help me out here?" He starts to put on his shoes and hears to his right where his tent was saying, "Don't get out, that wasn't me." He stayed in his tent and was hearing what sounded like the same people telling him 2 different things. He eventually falls asleep and wakes up to everyone packing in a rush. On the ground, written in black chalk or ash, it says, "Leave now or else." They immediately pack up and head back to their car, and now the car won't start. In such a rush, they hike out and back into town, go to the police station, and not a single officer accepts to go into the camp to investigate. After searching all day, they find a mechanic who has a tow truck, saying he would go in but for a hefty price. He tows the truck out, and once at his garage, it works fine. I didn't have to touch it. I couldn't understand why it didn't work before.